I grew up in an orphanage after my parents died in an accident, and I could not find the meaning of life or the meaning of doing my best. Then one day, I received a letter from my mother, who was supposed to be dead. Moreover, the letter was sent to the house where I used to live with my parents. This couldn't have happened. But what if? After days of thinking about it, I went to the address where the letter had been sent. But with my home of memories in front of me, I suddenly became frightened. So I decided to take a look from the backyard. Gently peeking in, I saw a middle-aged couple living there. I looked more closely at them. If they were complete strangers, I would have tried to sneak away. But the next moment, I couldn't believe my eyes. What? Dad, Mom. I stood there, as I had never imagined that this would happen. My name is Amelia, and I entered an orphanage when I was 10 years old and graduated there 2 years ago. Currently, I live alone in a cheap apartment in LA while working several part-time jobs. My parents passed away in a traffic accident when I was 10 years old. They were involved in a pile-up on the highway during the summer vacations. I was a passenger in that car, and thanks to the fact that I was sitting in the back seat, I miraculously survived. However, my parents, who were sitting in the driver's and front passenger seats, lost their lives when the impact of the pileup caused the truck in front of them to rear-end the car. That day was my birthday celebration, and I was on my way home from visiting a leisure pool that I had always wanted to go to. I was so tired that I fell asleep, when suddenly I felt a thump on my back like a cannonball, and the next thing I knew, my body was no longer able to move. With no sense of time, I frantically called out for my mom and dad. But with no answer from either of them, I lost consciousness, and the next time I woke up, I was on a hospital bed. The nurses who knew I was awake ran around busily, and the police and doctors came to my room one after another. All the while I wondered when my parents would come. Several times I asked the nurse, "Where are Mom and Dad?" but I was never quite sure because of the vague answers. My 10-year-old self thought, they must be in another hospital room. A few days later, however, I learned the meaning of the ambiguous answer. Someone who claimed to be my mother's sister came to me and told me that my parents' injuries were hopeless and that they were not expected to survive. She also told me that she had a family of her own and that she could not take me in. I couldn't understand what was going on. My mother's sister explained the situation to me in simple terms that I could understand, even though I was confused. As a result, I understood that, having lost both parents, I was destined to go to an orphanage upon my release from the hospital. There were many questions about what would happen to the house I was living in and what I would do about school, but I still remember feeling just a little relieved because I did not want to be part of a family of strangers. Later, when my injuries healed and I was able to move again, I was sent to the orphanage instead of going home. My mother's sister had organized the funeral and my belongings while I was in the hospital and sent them there. We had corresponded by letter since I was in the hospital, so I was informed of the situation beforehand. Honestly, I was very uncomfortable because I felt like a stranger was ransacking my house, but I was 10 years old and there was nothing I could do about it. Besides, I never thought I would be able to go home even once. I wanted to know why, but I didn't know who to ask or how to tell them. Everything was going on regardless of my will, and I just went along with the flow. Such were my days. Even after entering the orphanage, I received letters from my mother's sister several times a year, but the content was always the same. How are you? Do you have any troubles? At first I would write back, but soon I had nothing to write about. So, gradually, I stopped responding to the letters I received. To begin with, I had never met my mother's sister before my parents' death, so she was like a stranger to me. I felt nothing for being worried by a stranger, and exchanging letters with her was nothing but a hassle. Perhaps my feelings were conveyed, and the number of letters from my mother's sister decreased steadily as the years went by. By the time I graduated from the orphanage, I had become so estranged from my mother's sister that I had forgotten even the existence of her letters. I always spent my days at the orphanage feeling as if I had been left behind in some strange world. Perhaps it was because the funeral was held while I was in the hospital and I came to the orphanage without ever going home, but it never felt real to me. Why am I here? Such a sense of alienation always haunted me. And as I grew older, that feeling of alienation remained with me as a sense of loneliness. There is nothing left for me. Since there is nothing left, there is no point in trying. In this way, I became tired of everything and lost all motivation. So, after graduating from high school, I left the orphanage and found a job, but I could not get used to the gap between myself and the people around me and the atmosphere at the workplace, so I quit it immediately. After that, I became a job hopper, but it didn't last long because I felt that I didn't belong at any of the places I worked. It took me longer and longer to find a new job, and in no time at all my small savings ran out. I was living on the edge of my life, barely scraping by with a day job. What was the point of living in such loneliness? Wouldn't it be easier to just move out of the apartment and live on the street? I thought like that many times, but I always stopped just in time. My father and mother would probably be sad if they knew I was living on the street. Even though I knew that I would never see them again, I did not want to do anything that would make them sad. One day, when I was exhausted from these days, I received a call from the orphanage where I was staying that they had received a letter addressed to me. Perhaps because of the guilt I felt for quitting immediately after finding a job, I had been trying to avoid getting involved with the orphanage. Therefore, I had intended to have the letter thrown away without accepting it. However, as soon as I heard the name of the sender of the letter from the orphanage, I received a tremendous shock, as if I had been hit on the head with a hammer. To my surprise, the sender of the letter was my mother, who had supposedly died in an accident when I was 10 years old. I immediately went to the orphanage to receive the letter. Ever since I was contacted, my head had been in turmoil. My parents were supposed to have died in an accident when I was 10 years old. That is a fact that cannot be changed. So miracles don't happen, and the letter must have been some kind of mistake. I tried my best to calm myself down so as not to escape from reality. However, despite these feelings, the impossible hope that the accidental death was a mistake in the first place kept appearing in my mind. If my mother were still alive, Why would she have left me in the orphanage for so many years? What would happen if she just sent me a letter now? I continued to think about all of these things as I rode the train to the orphanage. But I could not come up with a satisfactory answer, nor could I sort out my feelings until the very end. Instead, my head was a jumbled mess of confusion, joy, doubt, anger, and sadness, and I felt as if I would start crying at any moment if I let up. By the time I arrived at the orphanage, after more than an hour, my mind had gone blank from overthinking. Anyway, let's see the actual thing and think about it first. I muttered to myself before entering the orphanage. When I received the letter in the office, I stared at the words on the envelope as if I were devouring them. It was unmistakably my deceased mother's handwriting, and the sender was also my mother. When I opened the envelope with trepidation, I found 3 pieces of paper with illustrations of my favorite characters from when I was 10 years old. And at the beginning of the first one, it says, "To Amelia, who is now 20 years old." The letter, which was written in my mother's soft and slightly quirky handwriting, was so densely packed that just looking at it made my heart ache and tears welled up in my eyes. The letter was filled with memories from the time I was born to the time I turned 10 years old, as well as her imagination and thoughts about how I would spend the next 10 years and grow up. It seemed it was my mother itself. I looked up at the ceiling many times to keep my tears from wetting the letter. Even so, I could not stop the tears from flowing, and they left tear stains in many places. After reading the letter, I thanked the people at the orphanage and immediately left. My head was still in turmoil, and I was in no condition to talk to anyone. On the train home, I read the letter over and over again. I did it because I felt that I might be able to grasp something by reading it over and over again. As a result, I came to the conclusion that this letter was written before the accident. At the time, a special half-coming-of-age ceremony was in vogue to celebrate the age of 10. I remembered that I was very interested in the half-coming-of-age ceremony, which I had learned about in school. My mother probably wrote this letter to commemorate my turning 10 years old and to express her hopes and wishes for the future 10 years from then. The question is, who sent this? The first person that came to mind was my mother's sister. However, we have been estranged for years, and I don't see why she would bother to send a letter in my mother's name. Besides, the sender's address was the house I lived in when I was 10 years old. If my mother's sister were the sender, she would send a letter with her own name and her own home address. I don't think she would remember me either, since we are so far apart that I have forgotten about her. I wondered who else could it be, but no one came to mind. The image of my mother in the letter filled me with happiness and confusion. What is the right way to feel? What should I do after reading this? No matter how much I thought about it, I could not come up with any answers. Tired of thinking, I put the letter away in a drawer and decided to pretend that nothing had happened and return to my normal routine. However, as the days went by, I couldn't help but wonder about the existence of the letter. I thought about throwing it away, but when I saw my mother's letters on the envelope, I could never do that. In that case, I decided to go see the sender of this letter. I had nothing to begin with, so I would have nothing more to lose than I have now. Besides, I might be able to ask the sender of the letter to help me make a living. I may have been subconsciously hoping for something from the sender of the letter that would change my current life. On the train to my old address, I gazed absent-mindedly at the cityscape, which was so different from my memories. Where there were only farmyards and forests, there are now large shopping centers and many houses. At the station where I got off the train, a bus roundabout had been completed, and there was even a fashionable cafe. I thought to myself, is this another world I don't know, and tottered to the address on the letter. A few minutes later, however, I turned the corner of the street and gasped at the sight before me. It was the same residential area as I remembered it from 10 years ago, almost unchanged. The view instantly brought me back to the vivid world of 10 years ago from the dim and colorless world. This is definitely the town where I used to live. And just down the road, our family home. Before I knew it, I was running toward home. A strange sense of security filled my heart, like a schoolgirl on her way home from school, like a child who had been lost for a long time. I ran with all my heart, and at the end of my run, I found my beloved home, just as I remembered it. The letter had come from home, after all. However, when I came to the house, I could not find the courage to press the intercom. The fear of what might happen outweighed my desire to find out the truth, and stopped me in my tracks. After pondering what to do, I decided to wait and see what happened, so I went around to the backyard. I felt somewhat uncomfortable, acting like a thief, but I quietly peeked into the garden. Then I saw what appeared to be a middle-aged couple preparing to sunbathe on the balcony. The man seemed to be in a wheelchair. I continued my observation to see if they were acquaintances. The couple's faces turned toward me for a moment as I could faintly hear them talking peacefully. The moment I saw their faces, I couldn't help but shout out. "What? Dad, Mom? They are not." As I stood there in surprise, the man in the wheelchair noticed me. "Amelia." The man muttered my name and suddenly began to cry loudly. I, on the other hand, was so shocked by the turn of events that I stopped thinking and couldn't move. The next moment, a woman who had returned home sensed the unusual atmosphere and came running out onto the balcony in a panic. Then she ran straight to the wheelchair and approached the man. The man was crying and pointing at me and saying something to the woman. The woman stared at me and suddenly smiled and said, "You are Amelia, right? Can you please come up so we can talk about something?" and invited me into her home. I was still not sure what was going on, but I had many questions I wanted to ask her. As I nodded silently, once again I visited through the front door and was led into the living room. After that, I was introduced to the woman whose name was Susan. I also learned that the man in the wheelchair was my father, Asher. Furthermore, I heard that the two were married and now live alone in this house. According to Susan's story, my father had been in an accident that left him unconscious and in a critical condition, hovering between life and death. I was told that there must have been an explanation for this to me, as I was only 10 years old, but I myself do not remember anything about it. When I told Susan about it, she asked, "How was it explained to you?" I told her that my mother's sister had told me that the situation was hopeless and that there was no hope of survival. However, thinking back, it seems that my mother was the only one who was told who died. If so, why was my father presumed dead? With Susan's help, I spent hours reconciling my memories with the truth. As a result, I realized that I had been greatly mistaken. As a 10-year-old who did not understand that my father was unconscious after the accident, I felt a one-sided rejection toward my father, who had not come to see me for a long time. My dad never comes to see me. I think he's mad because my mom died because I said I wanted to go to the leisure pool. That's how I felt as a 10-year-old, and I thought my father hated me. I guess that somehow it turned into a memory that both my father and mother had died in an accident at the same time. This is my guess, but I think it was less painful for Amelia at the time to think that your father hated you than to think that they were both dead. Susan followed up by saying that, but I honestly felt sorry for my father. But at the same time, a question came to my mind. I was extremely afraid to ask, but I knew that if I didn't know, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I willingly asked Susan, why didn't my father come for me? Susan thought for a moment and then gently looked over at my father. He nodded silently without saying anything, and as if on cue, Susan told us what had happened. Asher regained consciousness more than half a year after the accident. Half a year. That coincided with the time I was discharged from the hospital. He miraculously woke up, but it was several months after that when he was able to grasp the situation. It was not surprising that he woke up feeling as if he had slept overnight and it had been half a year since then. Furthermore, my father was left with a lot of disabilities in his memory, speech, and body due to the aftereffects of the accident. He was told by his doctor that he would never be able to return to his normal life. My mother's sister, who had originally heard that his recovery was hopeless, proceeded with the admission procedures to the orphanage as planned. When I came to, there was nothing left. It was a painful reminder of the length and importance of the time I had lost in my sleep. My father had tears in his eyes as he said this. According to Susan, my father entered the facility for the handicapped where Susan worked after he was discharged from the hospital. There was a time when he wanted to see Amelia, but he couldn't express himself properly. At the same time, he came to understand in his heart that Mary had passed away. Asher became very depressed for a time and was even hospitalized by a psychiatrist. There was a time when my father, who had lost everything, was searching for the meaning of life in despair, just like me. When I heard that story, I felt as if I had been saved tremendously. My father did not hate me or forget me. In fact, he cared for me to the point that I felt sick inside. At the moment I felt this, I felt a strange warmth, as if the cold loneliness that had been sitting in my heart was slowly melting away. According to Susan, my father's emotional state remained unstable even after he returned to the facility from psychiatric. Not only did he refuse rehabilitation, but he also had many behavioral problems, such as not eating, not communicating what he wanted to say, hitting the staff, and throwing things. The staff gradually became more and more clerical in their dealings with my father. While my father was treated like a tumor in the facility, Susan was the one who faced him without a single unpleasant look on her face. Susan communicated with my father using handmade cards and a whiteboard to help him understand what he wanted to say. She also massaged his muscles every day to prevent them from stiffening and found time to visit him to practice conversation. To Susan, my father said, "I felt a trace of Mary. I thought Mary would be sad to see me in such a disheveled state, and I felt I had no choice but to do my best," he said and squeezed her hand. I could clearly sense that Susan was very important to my father. I felt a little envy toward them. I wished I had someone to support me as well. After that, my father did his rehabilitation every day as if he had been reborn, and he never hit the staff anymore. My father, who had not even tried to get out of bed at the time of admission, then went to the rehabilitation room by himself and even worked out on his own. It is like a miracle just to hear it from beside me. But the real miracle lay ahead. Thanks to the frantic rehabilitation, my father recovered to the point where he was able to lead an everyday life. He was able to leave the facility for the handicapped. The doctors were surprised that they had never seen someone recover like this before. My father said so, a little proudly. Next to my father, Susan was smiling happily. Her smile was just like my late mother's, and my heart was filled with a strange sense of nostalgia and warmth. Speaking of my mother, I had not yet heard about the letter. I took my mother's letter out of my bag and asked them how they had sent it to me. Then my father suddenly turned his head and fell silent. Susan, who couldn't bear to look at him, told me how she had sent the letter on my father's behalf. After our marriage, I was cleaning out the room and happened to find this letter. Asher had been thinking about Amelia for a long time, but he had been avoiding you because he felt he wasn't worthy of seeing you, so I convinced him that he should at least send you a letter. Susan's explanation finally connected the jumbled pieces in my head into one. It was all a prank of fate. Because of the accident and his disability, my father could not come to see me. I had assumed that my father was dead. We both felt lonely and led dimly lit lives. However, Susan and this letter left by my mother brought my father and me together. I never forgot about Amelia, but I felt sorry that I could not do anything for you for so long. I couldn't make up my mind that it would be a nuisance if I contacted you then. I'm really sorry. My father bowed deeply to me as he said this. When I heard about my father's past situation and suffering, I did not blame him at all. On the contrary, I was honestly happy to know that he had been thinking about me. Moreover, the fact that the timing of my father's desperation was the same as mine made me realize, in a strange way, that we were father and daughter, and I almost laughed a little. When I told Susan and my father about this, they both burst into tears and laughed. It was the first time in my life that I had seen warm tears. I looked out the window and saw the setting sun on the balcony. I told them that it was time to go home, and stood up. Then, in a panicked voice, my father stopped me. "Wait a minute. We've just met, I don't want to leave Amelia alone anymore. I don't know if I have the right to say this now, but I want to be a family again. Stay here, Amelia." My father bows his head pleadingly, shedding different tears than before. I was so happy inside that he was thinking about me that much, but at the same time, I couldn't shake off the fear that I would destroy his happiness with Susan. The feeling that I had to say no clashed with my desire to live with my father as is, and I was stuck. I stood there for a while, unable to answer anything. If I were your mother, do you think I would refuse? What? I stared at Susan's face at this sudden question. Susan was smiling gently at me, as if she could see right through my hesitant heart. Not only her smile, but also her generous and gentle care was just like my mother's. I felt as if my real mother pushed my back. I had the courage to be honest about my feelings. If it is okay with you if I am like this, please let me be your family. When I answered in a loud voice, my father looked up vigorously and was so excited and happy that I thought he was going to fall off his wheelchair. Seeing my father like that, I laughed out loud for the first time in 10 years. I was finally able to return to a world where I belong. Half a year has passed since then. I am now studying English hard to become a flight attendant, which was my dream. Next year, I plan to take the entrance exam to enter a vocational school. Before I came back here, I had no motivation to do anything and had quit thinking about my dreams and future. However, when I was reunited with my father and had time to think about my future, my mother's letter guided me once again. At the end of that letter, she wrote, "What are you doing now? Did you become a flight attendant, which was your dream? No matter what the future holds, I'm rooting for you, Amelia." With my mother's kind thoughts in my heart, I decided to go ahead and pursue my dream. And I secretly hope to repay my father and Susan with my first salary someday.